Greetings everybody and welcome back to the Austin Lindsay channel. Today I'm talking about the Weelite Ninja 400 Mark II. This is a 150 watt bicolor COB light. This light has a really great build quality. It feels very similar to something out of the Aperture line. The body of the light is made of metal. The yoke is made of metal. There are a few areas of plastic where Aperture would probably have used metal, but overall the light feels very robust. And there are a few design features that do seem odd to me that I'll point out as we go along. One of them being this very cheap plastic tightening nut. And as I mentioned before, the light does have some plastic on it, but those areas have some really nice durable filling plastic. The nut on this is just kind of like a bolt just encased in plastic, and it feels like more of a cheaper plastic. And it's not a huge deal because these are pretty easily replaceable. If this breaks, you can just swap it out pretty easy. But this is the only part that I noticed that uses that cheaper plastic. So maybe they were just using up some leftover parts in the factory or something. There's this nice handle on the back for positioning or carrying, and it has a really nice single knobbed yoke design. And one of my favorite things is this very large modifier release lever. There's so many lights these days that have just this little tiny pin or a flush mount lever, and it's just really nice to see this type of design where you can really get your thumb in there. So this does come with a standard mirrored reflector for a more focused point of light, and yes, this is a Bowens mount. So moving on from the light, you have this 10-foot robust, really well-made filling cable, and this will plug into your controller unit. And there's also a brick that plugs into the controller unit, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So the controller is made out of entirely plastic except for a few pieces of metal right here, but it doesn't feel cheap or flimsy. It all feels really well made and durable, and it's very lightweight. The unit alone is just under 2 pounds, and the unit with the mount here is 2.7 pounds. So on the front you have your large pressable rotating knob, and then you have 4 smaller buttons. On the back you have your V-mount battery plate. On the top you have your connector to the power brick, and on the bottom you have your connector to the light along with USB-C and DMX in and out. Then along the side you have your stand mount. So the mount has this really simple push button release system, which is really easy to use. The one thing I wish is that you could flip this around, because if you have this mounted on your stand and the controller is facing away from you, you can't just flip this and then mount it upside down and then have it facing to you. You have to undo the whole thing from the stand, then flip the thing around and tighten it back on. So it does take a lot more time. Everything will be mounted upside down, which is not a huge deal breaker because everything is large and easy to read, but it's just another one of those odd design quirks. So speaking of odd design quirks, let me go back and talk about the connectors for a second. So the connector to the light, which usually goes above the controller, is actually on the bottom of the unit. And then the connector that comes from the power brick, which usually goes below the controller, is on the top of the unit. So when you set this light up, you're actually crossing wires and you're losing about 1 foot of connection due to the length of the controller and then the cable relief. And then the brick actually has no way of attaching itself to a mount or a stand of any kind, and it only has about 4 feet of lead coming out of the end. And I also wouldn't advise letting this hang, since if you damage the cable, you have to take it out and resolder it up. So straight out of the box, you'd probably have to have your connector laying on the floor, and then you'd need to mount your controller about 3 feet from the floor, since you'd be losing about 1 foot of distance here to connect your cable on the top of the unit, and then you'd be losing about 1 foot of cable from the light cable, since you have to mount this on the bottom of the connector. You'd still get about 12 vertical feet of length, which is still very usable in most cases, but if you're mounting this in some other way than horizontally on a light stand, this might be something to be aware of. So here's a little something I did try, but you should only try it at your own risk. The connector from the brick is an XLR style connector, so I was able to connect one of my microphone cables between the brick and the controller, and then it'll power the light. This lets me leave the brick on the floor and then move the controller up at a higher level on the stand, which is much more helpful. I'm not sure if this is advisable. If anyone knows if this is safe or not, leave a comment. Honestly though, I wish they would have just combined the brick and the controller into one unit. This would allow me to have one attach point for power and control instead of attaching one and then trying to figure out what to do with the other. It would also been a little bit more heavier. That way I could have used this whole thing as a sandbag or a counterweight of some sort, and it would have gotten rid of this extra length of cable. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about some features. So as I said at the beginning, this is a bicolor light. It goes from 2800K to 6800K in 100K increments with a color stability of plus or minus 300K. It has a CRI of 95 and the manual states 150 watts. So I took some measurements and I'll leave a little bit more detailed information in the description below. But at 100% at 1 meter, I measured 4,500 lux, and this is without the reflector. And then I measured 25,000 lux with the reflector. So there's a scene or effects mode with your standard effects. Since this user interface uses numbers instead of icons, I assume they're just the standard broken bulb, paparazzi, lightning, fire, etc. You do have DMX, so you could use this light with a DMX controller. So pressing the mode set button will take you into that section, and pressing the mode set button again will take you into the wireless functions. And this is where you can change the group or channel functions for using it with the included remote or the phone app. Then you can press the mode set button again to turn off all external controls and just control everything via the buttons on the unit itself. So my overall thoughts, the build quality seems really awesome and ready for your average freelancer filmmaker. There are some pretty odd design quirks like the cross cabling on the controller and the separate DC brick. That kind of makes it a tough sell for ease of use if you're using this on set and if you're tearing it down and setting it up all the time. But if you don't mind those, or if you're leaving it set up at a studio or on a desk or something like that, and you're not tearing it down and setting it up a bunch, then you have a light with bicolor, DMX controllability, Bluetooth/remote capability, and great build quality at a really decent price. So this has been the Weelite Ninja 402. If you guys do have any questions, leave them in the comments field. I'll do my best to answer them. And thanks everyone for watching.